WTO Matters in advance of the WTO's 14th Ministerial Conference. It's been our hope that this seminar series is especially helpful to individuals who may be supporting their ministries in advance of MC-14 and others interested in the structure and functioning of the WTO. You can watch all the past events in this series for free on our YouTube page, thanks to the support of our WITA International sponsors, the National Pork Producers Council, Trade Data Monitor, Coupang, Visa, U.S. Council for International Business, National Foreign Trade Council, and the Information Technology Industry Council. Since the launch of this series in December, we've had 1,500 total live viewers on Zoom and another 1,500 post listeners on and watchers on YouTube. So that's 3,000 viewers from 51 countries plus this morning's attendees. And of that number, 21% are from the US government and another 10% from governments around the world. We're pleased to have been able to bring this series to all our members and followers around the world. And thanks to all of you who've joined us and to our friend and partner in this series, Angela Ellard. I'm going to dispense with a more lengthy introduction to get to right to our first guest, the Director General of the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Most of the WITA membership first met Dr. Okonjo-Iweala all the way back in 2020, when she was a candidate to be Director General, one of the 8 interviews we conducted during the pandemic of candidates to be Director General. What stood out, Dr. Ngozi, about all those interviews at that time were the 2 things: the hundreds of people who watched your live interview that day, more than any of the other interviews, and the thousands who've watched it since, the most of all our pandemic-era webinars. And something else I don't think we've ever talked about, which is your personal touch. You were the only one of the candidates who came back after the interview to ask us for contact information for some of the people in the audience so you could follow up with them personally. That personal touch is something we noticed for the first time when we met at that online event, and something that is notable in your leadership of the WTO. Thank you for joining us. At later events we had in Washington and again in Geneva and again today. So thank you, Dr. Ngozi. It's an honor and a pleasure to host you again. And I'll turn it over now to Angela.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, for the introduction. Thank you, of course, to WITA for creating this very important global platform for discussions about the WTO. And a special thanks, of course, to the Director General. Dr. Ngozi, it's such a pleasure to be with you again. I've been away from the WTO now for about 6 months. It seems like a long time, but very short at the same time. And there's a lot to talk about with MC-14 just 9 days away. So my first question for you is, how do you define success at MC-14? There's, of course, the extension of the moratorium and the work program on e-commerce that need to be resolved. But how far will ministers get on much needed reform, given differences among the ministers in ambition and content, and discussions about everything from decision-making to development, MFN, level the playing field? You've called this the turning point ministerial, which I think is quite apt. Are you where you had hoped to be right now?
Well, thanks, Angela, and it's lovely to see you. We miss you, and it's so gracious of Ken and of WITA to have me back. This is, I think, a very important ministerial for the WTO. The world has changed, and it's changing considerably at a very fast pace. So it's not only the fact that there's so much uncertainty and turbulence around the trade agenda, but there's also the fast movement of technology and the advent of AI. And I think that in the midst of this change, a lot of it positive, I have to say, people don't focus on that, but also the tremendous uncertainty. There's no doubt that the WTO really has to grasp the mettle of reform and to grapple with it. Reform is not a new subject at the WTO. There's been talk about it, and there's some working level type of reforms in the committees that have been done, called Reform by Doing, which have gone quite well. But this time we're talking of a deeper and higher level of reform. So I think success at the ministerial will be whether ministers can come together and have the political will to endorse a program of work on reform. So let me be clear. Are we where we're supposed to be going in from Geneva? I think yes. I never expected that we would go in with some consensus agreement that everybody has exactly the same idea on how the reform is to be done. That would be expecting too much in a body with 166 members. What we really worked hard on is to get everybody on the same page that we do need to work on these deep reforms. And I think we're there. Now, where the divergence is some people feel that such and such is a bigger priority for me on the reform. Others feel this is another priority. So there's differences. There are differences in terms of what to prioritize going in. But what is good is that everyone agrees that we need to move forward on significant reform. So what are we expecting ministers to do? We are not expecting them to come to the ministerial and in 4 days give us the answers to the reform problems. No. Because each one area entered into in the reform, whether it's decision-making or level playing field or development issues, or even others that might come up later, will need a certain amount of groundwork to determine what went wrong exactly and what do we need to work towards the solution. We want ministers to come and endorse a program of reforms after their discussions. We want them to agree that these are the issues that merit reform as a first phase, and then endorse that program. So that's one. If we can get there and have the political will to do that, that would be, I think, very, very helpful. In addition to that, there are other deliverables, specifics. The e-commerce moratorium you mentioned, Angela. I think businesses are expecting that we should be able to deliver something on this. Again, members, some want a permanent moratorium, others want just a normal 2-year extension. Others are in the middle. There's even a member that doesn't want a moratorium. So we have to bring members together. There are few proposals being sent forward, but the attitude is positive. Members seem willing to negotiate to really come to some agreement on where they want to be on the moratorium. So I'm hopeful. Then we've got the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, which is something to enable 128 members. This is a plurilateral that seeks to help members take away the bureaucracy and all the obstacles that sometimes confront those who want to invest in countries, in member countries, especially developing countries. They want to incorporate this agreement into the WTO framework. Again, if we can deliver that, that would be very good. And and then we've got to have very serious discussions and agreements on how to move forward on agriculture. We've been trying to make a breakthrough on that for years. Ministers are not expected to negotiate an agreement, but to find ways and give clear direction on how to break the impasse in agriculture. There are other development issues from, talking about least developed countries and their needs, to issues around the remittances and technology transfer, and that members are interested in the development session. The key issue there is, what can trade do to help members become more prosperous? How can developing countries get a better share of world trade and move forward? So these are some of the important issues we also expect ministers to pronounce on. And finally, the reform of the dispute settlement system. This is key and central to every member. Work has been done. We are going to get an update on where that work stands, and then ministers to give clear direction on where to move forward next. Thank you.
Thank you for laying out all of those work streams. And obviously the eyes of the world are, everyone's watching to see what emerges. And thank you for describing the plan in terms of the roadmap and the historic opportunity here, the first time really ministers have gotten together to talk about reform in a solid way. Now, one of the strengths of the WTO is the ability to negotiate and adopt plurilateral agreements among a coalition of the willing. You described the the investment facilitation agreement that is so important for developing members. And these plurilaterals are obviously an important opportunity to increase the speed and ambition through incubation. So what is, in your view, the future of plurilateralism in the WTO if one member, say, can block the adoption into the multilateral rulebook, even though it is not taking on any of the obligations of the agreement?
Well, thanks, Angela. I just want to remind everyone that plurilaterals are already part of the WTO architecture. So we already have plurilaterals that were carried over from the GATT into the WTO, and even since then we have other plurilaterals. So they're already part of the architecture. We have the Information Technology Agreement, which is much loved by business because it really offers zero to very low tariffs for goods related to information technology. And I might say very proudly that it is powering all the equipment that is being used for AI. So this is an agreement that covers $3 trillion in goods. We have the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement that tries to sweep away all the obstacles in front of delivery of services. So we have them as part of the architecture. I think what is new is that for new plurilaterals, there's a provision that they can be incorporated into the architecture of the WTO to join the others. And this has not been done before. So the Investment Facilitation Agreement would be the first. So plurilaterals, I think, are there. The issue is, how can we indeed, as you said, allow coalitions of willing members to use them more easily and readily? Because none has ever been tried to be incorporated in the way envisaged. It's become something new. And yes, we do have a couple of members who feel that maybe if we do more and more plurilaterals, that might somehow undermine the multilateral agreements. We are trying to explain and be clear that those who founded the organization and made this provision must have seen that there's room for both. So it will indeed be discussed as part of the reform proposals to see how can we really use this in a more agile way. How can members, if a plurilateral is not materially harming their economic interests, be able to allow willing coalitions to move forward? Again, I'm hopeful. I see this as part of the upcoming architecture just because we need it. In a fast-moving world, you need to be able to allow members to come together. Maybe if not everybody is ready or interested, they can make an agreement. That doesn't take away from the multilateral agreement, which is the key and the centerpiece of the WTO. That will not go anywhere. Why am I so confident? Because we have global public goods that can only be tackled through multilateral agreements. There are certain things that you need all countries to work on in cooperation globally, and so there'll be room for that.
I think we only have about a minute, so I will pose one last question, a bit of a tough question, if you don't mind. So for as long as the WTO is old, we've seen a proliferation of regional trade agreements, and even more recently, that trend seems to have increased. Some of them are within the WTO framework, within the rule book of covering substantially all trade. Others, perhaps not so. And we've recently seen a lot of agreements like CPTPP expanding to include the UK, possibly the EU. There are agreements now with India, with the EU and the US. Does this, and of course the fact that the US has negotiated a number of reciprocal trade agreements, which are not being offered, the benefits are not being offered with respect to tariffs on an MFN basis. So what does this mean? What does this mean for the future? Does this mean that these types of agreements are taking the attention that should be the path? Is the WTO left just with the rules on the books? Or can these two work streams coexist?
Well, yes, thank you, Angela. It's a tough question, but not as tough as I thought.
Oh.
In the sense that, look, we've had these regional agreements and we've had bilateral agreements, and again, the WTO architecture, these have existed, as you said, but of course, in recent times, they've multiplied. And we've seen the bilateral agreements, by the US, which are non-MFN. So those are clearly outside the system. In spite of all these agreements, I just want to share one thing. We've been looking at the MFN share, and even with the agreements we see, we find that 72% of world trade is still taking place on WTO MFN terms. We did some analysis recently. I'm probably not supposed to share this number, but anyway. But what was interesting to me, when the IPA tariffs were removed, they quickly redid the analysis. The MFN share went up, as you would expect, somewhat. But then Section 122 was put on, and it's come back down again, and we're back at about 72%. And we'll be releasing these numbers properly again in a couple of days. Oh, God, I shouldn't have said that. But I just wanted to see that, there's a great deal of stability around the core WTO MFN share. Now, the other types of agreements, the regional trade agreements and the bilateral trade agreements, at some point, if you looked at them, you would see that they had a 36% share. But when you look at actual utilization of these agreements by businesses, and we've got a whole unit devoted to this, they look at all the agreements. When you look at actual utilization, you see only 16%. Why is that? Because sometimes businesses, when they've seen a regional agreement negotiated or bilateral, sometimes when they try to use it, they find that some of the rules have high compliance costs. We've actually calculated that some of these may have up to 7 or 8% higher cost in compliance. And what do they do? Whether it's rules of origin that they have to go through and prove and so on. So what do? They don't then use it. Then they go back to using the core MFN terms. And that is why you see so much stability around the core. So I'm not so concerned. I think a lot of the agreements, as you noted, many of them comply with WTO rules and so are WTO compliant. And those that do not, many of them, businesses don't use them to the extent people think. What I see going forward, Angela, is an architecture of the core WTO, including any new agreements we may enter into, surrounded by these other types of agreements, whether they are regional trade agreements or bilateral agreements. Many of them are WTO compliant. They are FTAs. So I'm not trying to say that I'm not worried. We have about 11 to 12% that is totally not WTO compliant. As I said, the agreements, reciprocal agreements made by the US are not. But when you do all the analysis, and I've quoted you all the numbers now, you will see there's a core, there will be a surrounding outer core of these agreements, and I think that's how we go forward. And we're okay with it. We do not believe that it's suddenly going to be a system where more and more are moving away from WTO terms. There may be more agreements, but many of them are WTO compliant.
Well, thank you for that, and delighted to have the scoop that you gave us on those statistics. Really appreciate
They'll kill me. The economists will kill me.
But one, I think, important aspect of this, of course, is sometimes these regional trade agreements, even though they may not be MFN, they sometimes use the leverage to push a WTO goal, like on the e-commerce moratorium. So there's some benefit there too from the WTO.
Yes.
Well, Ken,
That's absolutely true. And, we welcome the US. The US has tried to be engaged. It's engaging fully at the WTO, and we welcome that, and trying to be helpful where it can be. Some places not so helpful, but where it's helpful, it's been working well. So, yeah, thank you.
well, thank you. Ken, I see you've come on. Thanks for giving us a little extra time. Thank you, Director General, in the midst of everything you have going on. Thanks for joining us today. And good luck with
Thank you.
MC-14.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye.
Agozi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We,
Thanks.
WITA will be back at the public forum in September, and we look forward to seeing you then. And we'd like to now invite our panelists to please turn on their cameras. A reminder for all of you who are watching on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom. You should have also received a copy of today's event program by email, and that email contains a link to see our panelist biographies. As a reminder, what we say on this webinar today is current based on what we know today, Tuesday, March 17th at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. in Europe. But things are changing quickly in the trade world, so if you're not watching this live, things might have changed. To wrap up our series, we have an amazing panel assembled to discuss key issues on the MC-14 agenda, and just as importantly, what comes next in a post-MC-14 work plan on WTO reform, and how the organization stays relevant in a time of volatility and uncertainty. I'd like to welcome Jake Colvin, President of the National Foreign Trade Council and Executive Director of the Global Innovation Forum. Cecilia Malmstrom is a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a former European Commissioner for Trade. Penny Noss is a Senior Vice President for Innovation and Competitiveness at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And Ambassador Tan Hung Seng, Singapore's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the WTO. And our moderator, of course, Angela Ellard, a non-resident Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the former Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Angela, thank you for your partnership in leading this discussion of the WTO and critical issues in advance of MC-14.
Well, thank you very much, Ken. And of course, thanks to WITA. Thanks to our panel now for joining us today. We all heard the Director General, the comments that she made about her expectations of what will happen at MC-14. And today's focus is on MC-14, of course, but also what comes after MC-14 in about 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks' time will be in the aftermath of MC-14. As Ken has described, this is our last of 7 panels. And we've had the opportunity in these panels to talk with 12 ambassadors representing diverse opinions, positions, and goals at the WTO. And we've also had experts from the WTO Secretariat, the private sector, think tanks, and more, talking about the WTO, reform, the future. And our global audience, of course, has engaged us and challenged us in the smoking hot Q&A function. So the world is watching, and MC-14 begins in 9 days. But at the same time, MCs are just points in time, and the work continues immediately after. So let's jump right into it and talk about what we can expect. So my first question, and I hope this will be a very interactive conversation. My first question relates to the fact that the WTO is carrying out its regular work and determining its next steps at a time of tremendous uncertainty, as the Director General mentioned. And members point to a variety of causes for this uncertainty, everything from US tariffs to distortions created by non-market economies, a looming energy and shipping crisis, supply chain disruptions, disparities in levels of development, and the great AI technology frontier, just to name a few. So what does all of this uncertainty, regardless of the cause, what does all of this uncertainty mean for the post MC-14 work plan on WTO reform? How does the WTO stay relevant at a time of such volatility and uncertainty? Cecilia, perhaps I will start with you.
Well, thank you, Angela, and thank you to WITA for inviting me to this important discussion. I'm honored to be in this panel. Well, as you describe, and as the DG also described, there are so many challenges right now, and it's ironic that when the world is really facing a huge need for international cooperation, multilateral organizations such as WTO, but not only them, a lot of others as well, the UN, etc., are weaker than in many, many decades. So, of course, this is something we have to deal with. I think we need to be realistic on the expectations of WTO. As we heard, there is the hope that members will endorse some kind of working program with a few defined areas to work on. And that is good. I mean, that shows that at least if that is agreed, that shows that the organization is there. It's always useful to meet on a ministerial level. Those of us who've been at MCs, we know that when ministers meet, things can really happen. But of course, after that, and if there is a working program with deadlines and so on, that has to go on in Geneva and with ministers in capitals. But there has to be also some kind of sort of plurilateral activism in this, trying to gather groups of countries who feel, like you mentioned, the need, the urge, the necessity to deal with new global rules and AI, with the greening of trade, with subsidies, with level playing field, etc., etc. And I think there is a market to do that. And it can start in smaller groups, and then long as they're open, fully transparent, and in line with existing WTO rules, I think that could work. We have seen some of this emerging in the EU CPTPP that are coming together now. There would be a ministerial meeting in the margins of WTO as well, and they are outlining not only how to reform WTO as it is today, but also how they can facilitate rules and standards between them that could possibly be joined by others, and then eventually going into WTO rules as well. So I think we need really to take advantage of some members really feeling the need to elaborate these rules and start small and grow from there.
Thank you. Thank you for that, for laying out this activism, plurilateral activism, as you put it, that's necessary. Jake, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Angela. Good to see you, and great to be here, Penny, with you, Cecilia, and Ambassador Tan. I think it's important to maybe just zoom out and remember why we all wanted a WTO in the first place. We wanted to coalesce around a common standard, a common set of rules to trade in goods and services, and including around things like protecting IP and investment, following common standards, and also reporting changes and resolving disputes. And I think we take a lot of these nuts and bolts for granted. If you think of things like trade facilitation, customs valuation, SPS, technical barriers to trade, our members tell us, our member companies tell us regularly that they value those foundations of the WTO. And I think even with all the disruption and uncertainty, the institution continues to be pretty good at a lot of those things. Obviously the negotiating and dispute settlement functions have broken down. And at the same time, the organization has been asked to deal with more complex issues that it really just isn't sort of well suited to deal with, including around national security and challenges of non-market economies. And so, for me, if we're going to have a meaningful reform agenda, we sort of need to start by getting back to the basics. And I would just offer maybe a couple of suggestions as ministers go into MC-14. One, and Dr. Akanjo-Iweala and Cecilia both alluded to this, is fixing the negotiating function and making sure to allow more room for plurilaterals. It was really heartened to hear what Dr. Akanjo-Iweala said about her optimism about the future of sort of like-minded countries coming together. She pointed out that the roadmap is already there. I think we just need to sort of fix that last mile and the ability to get consensus. And it's frankly been really exciting for businesses to be able to bring new issues to the WTO. Even where it hasn't resulted in agreements, you've had work on environmental goods, on services, on COVID. And now looking ahead to things like critical minerals and AI and digital, that's all, I think, really exciting. And then, going back and supporting the WTO's basic research, convening, capacity building, technical assistance roles. They did good work on COVID during supply chains. They brought an innovative approach to implementing trade facilitation obligations. I think there's a lot of good there that we can all get behind and support. And then maybe just to finish off, I think there are two other things that are really important. One is, I think members really do need to do some soul searching about why they wanted to be part of the WTO in the first place. If countries can't sort of collectively affirm that they want to engage constructively and be bound by the rules, then talking about reform is kind of like a marriage counselor trying to get a couple to agree on who's going to take out the trash when they aren't really sure that they believe in the institution of marriage anymore. And so I think we really do need to coalesce and reaffirm our collective commitment to the institution. And then finally, I think Cecilia alluded to this, is we also need to be honest with each other about the limits of the WTO, right? It's clear that the WTO can't enforce all of the rules all of the time. And a lot of bad behavior has been allowed to fester. So whatever anyone thinks about the tactics of the current administration, they've been incredibly effective in getting a lot of countries to change their policies because of their aggressive unilateral approach. And that never would have happened if they would have relied on the WTO. I think for me, the question is going forward is how do we balance our unilateral, bilateral, and plurilateral approaches outside of the WTO while also strengthening and while not undermining the organization? And hope that ministers will kind of wrestle with those questions at and after MC-14.
Well, thank you very much, Jake, for laying that out, the need to coalesce and reaffirm support for the organization while being honest about the limitations at the same time. Would any of the other panelists like to speak to this? Should we move on to the next question? Ambassador Tan, Hung Sen, yes, please go ahead.
Angela,
yes.
Thank you. Happy to jump in at this point, but first, very big thank you to Ken, to WITA, and to you for giving me this opportunity to participate in this panel. You had asked, what does all this flux in the world mean for post-MC-14 work plan on the WTO reform? And I think the short answer is that it has given greater impetus and greater urgency for members to be seriously committed to WTO reform. Because as Ngozi loved to say, status quo is no longer an option. And I think it's very true that the status quo for the WTO is no longer an option. And if members seriously value the organization, then we must be serious in committing to improve the way in which the WTO can deliver outcomes and meaningful outcomes that make a difference in the lives of our people, of our businesses, of our consumers. So the short answer is that it has given greater impetus and urgency to members, and we can sense that urgency here, not among all members, but among a great majority of the members. So the question that all members have to ask ourselves honestly is, one, do we really value the WTO? Two, if we do, what can we do to make it more effective and able to deliver? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a very honest and heartfelt perspective, so I appreciate that. Well, perhaps if there is no one else that wants to comment on this question, we can move on to the next, which relates to digital trade. Digital trade innovation have obviously been a great accelerator of growth for many, but many countries are concerned that they don't have the digital infrastructure to be able to take advantage and to use this to prosper. So one big task for MC-14 is to determine the next steps on the e-commerce moratorium, the moratorium on the collection of duties for electronic transmissions, as well as the work program on e-commerce, both of which expire at MC-14. So whether this is a short-term extension, medium-term, permanence, or at least indefinitely extended, or no extension at all, and possibly a standing committee to replace the work program. How important are these decisions for the WTO, for its members, both developed and developing, and for the private sector, both large companies as well as small and medium-sized enterprises? We have a question in the chat asking about SMEs. So perhaps I can turn to Jake first here and then move from there. Over to you, Jake.
Thanks, Angela. And so, look, I do think that these issues are critical, certainly for businesses, but also for small and large developed and developing economies, and also for the credibility of the World Trade Organization. Over the past year, the thing that I've heard most from companies is how uncertainty is sort of debilitating for businesses for making trade and investment decisions. But we've been living with the uncertainty around the moratorium for 25 years, and we just frankly desperately need to get beyond that. I don't know how many of you out there have seen the movie Groundhog Day with Bill Murray and Andie MacDowell. Bill is living the same day over and over as a weatherman and covering Groundhog Day. It feels like we're at that point in the movie where Bill Murray is sort of dropping a toaster into the bathtub and running into the path of Mack truck because he's concluded that death would be better than having to live this day, one more time. And for me, there's so much that is exciting in digital and AI and e-commerce, which I hope we can get into later. But the reality is that we waste a completely ridiculous amount of time every 2 years to repeat this same outcome over and over again on the moratorium and the work program. The optimistic part of me feels like we could be pretty close to like that perfect day at the end of the movie where with Andie MacDowell that sort of lets them escape and move on with their lives. And I think we really do need to get to a permanent decision, not only on the moratorium, but also, Angela, as you mentioned, on kind of a permanent work program. Because I think if we can do that, there's sort of an opportunity to redirect that energy into helping the WTO meet the moment on AI and digital. So I do hope that members will come together to support USTR's proposal for a permanent ban. But I also did want to emphasize the importance of the work program, particularly for developing countries, to have just the advice. If the work program is going to be meaningful, they need to, that can't be temporary, and they need to have kind of an ongoing conversation that doesn't get hijacked by process every 2 years. It's hard to sort of do anything more than scratch the surface when we're arguing about whether it's going to even continue. So I think, for the WTO to be relevant, the easiest and lowest hanging fruit that ministers could get out of the ministerial is to just step up and do this. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your unforgettable Groundhog Day analogy there. Although you did kind of give away the end of the movie for those who haven't seen it. Would any of my other Penny, would you like to speak on this? Thank you.
Yeah, so to follow up on Jake's comments, I think, one of the things I think is always hard for trade negotiators is that there's all kinds of other stuff going on in the world, and yet trade negotiators are extremely skilled at talking about trade. But trying to reconcile all the different things that are going on in the world today and to incorporate that into trade rules is incredibly complicated. So, here we are, and I spend a lot of time deep thinking on AI. What is AI going to do? What is it going to mean? If I knew the answers, I'd buy lottery tickets and I would retire tomorrow. But I think all of us are watching this play out. The WTO has done a nice report on AI last year, and I think it's in the World Trade Report, where they outlined 3 scenarios on how AI could play out. There's probably another 10 you could put alongside of that in terms of how AI is going to ripple across economies and reconfigure the global order, at least economically, in various ways. And so I think that for this MC-14, it's a really fascinating time. Geopolitically, you've got this conflict now in Iran going on that is going to be rippling through. A lot of people are focused on the oil markets, but I'm more focused on the agriculture markets and what it's going to mean for food and for farmers and for agriculture. But that's the goods. The issue really is going to be AI is going to come in and I think change the dynamics around what we produce and what we trade that are goods and what we produce and what we trade in terms of services. And I wonder if, the current rules around services are really fit for purpose in terms of where AI may be taking us next. So all of this, I think, are dimensions that, there is a discussion about standing up an e-commerce working group or a digital trade working group, which I think is a little awkwardly named because I really think it's about artificial intelligence. And I think what you're going to see is the tensions in the WTO between the development agenda and what developing companies want are really going to be playing out in this space in particular, because this is really about where the future is headed and how all of us are going to be able to take advantage of this in terms of trade, in terms of economic growth in the future, and in terms of where we go.
Thank you. And thanks for pointing out how AI can be such a disruptor in a good way and a bad way in terms of the rules and how they relate. Any of my other panelists? Okay. All right. Well then, Hung Sen, yes, please go ahead.
Angela, I just want to say that I agree 100% with what Penny has just said, that AI is going to be or has become the most significant disruptor. But unfortunately, at the WTO, we are always 1 or 2 steps or even more behind. We are really behind the curve in terms of addressing the nexus between AI and trade. At the moment, we are still grappling with the very basics of digital trade, the moratorium on custom duties on electronic transmissions, and also the e-commerce agreement. So yes, ideally, the WTO should start addressing the nexus between AI and trade. But realistically, I think our focus at MC-14 and even in the post-MC-14 would be to ensure, like Jake say, that we secure, hopefully, ideally, a permanent extension of the moratorium. And here, I just want to say that members, especially developing members, have to recognize that digital trade is like a wave that is coming at us. If we do nothing because of the digital gap, then we run the risk of being washed over. Or we can take advantage, ride the wave of digital trade and use it to deliver real benefits to our businesses, to our consumers. And here, I think the work program on e-commerce can play an important role in narrowing the digital gap. And here, I think we can do more with the private sector to create greater synergy in terms of delivering technical assistance, helping to level up developing members in terms of their foundational digital infrastructure. These are all things that we can do more with the private sector. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And your comments are especially significant given that Singapore, of course, acts as co-convener for the e-commerce agreement, the plurilateral agreement, and that Singapore was part of the effort to that tabled, the group of countries that tabled the paper to make the work program, a permanent standing committee. So I know you've definitely thought long and hard about these issues. So I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, if I may. It seems that the concept of MFN is under attack by the US explicitly in the paper that it submitted on WTO reform. And of course, Ambassador Barloon spoke to this at one of our WITA panels earlier in this series. And the EU has also pointed to shortcomings of MFN. And Ambassador Machado pointed out some of these, and the EU submitted a paper as well. At the same time, as the DG noted, 72% of global trade is covered by MFN rules, and most members do staunchly defend the concept. So my question to the panel is, should MFN be maintained, revised, abandoned? Your thoughts? Anyone like to start? Cecilia, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't hear. I will listen afterwards, the former episode on this. And I noticed that in the reform paper published by the European Union and in light of this upcoming conference, that it says that it should be reformed. However, I'm very doubtful of how it could be reformed, actually. MFN is such a fundamental principle of the whole WTO corporation. So either you abolish it or you keep it, but reforming it, I haven't seen anybody giving a credible analysis of how that could happen. Maybe you could have exceptions for individual products or something like this. But I want to ask my clever co-panelists, how could it be reformed?
Jake.
Not sure I have specific reform proposals at the top of my fingertips, but I guess I would just point out that MFN has never been absolute. There's always exceptions. In the United States, we have anti-dumping countervailing duties, safeguards, sanctions, all the further liberalization via free trade agreements that we're all a part of, lying on top of MFN. And so, there's already flexibilities in MFN, and I think the friction and the further deviation from MFN, particularly here in the United States, has been because of the idea that if you can't fix some really intractable problems, it's going to lead to sort of nuclear solutions. And so, I noticed Minister Šefčovič's op-ed in the FT where he proposed the idea of linking MFN and reciprocity. What is the true or like market access that countries are giving to each other? So I don't have all the solutions, but I think if there's a way to preserve the fundamental concept behind MFN while thinking about what further allowances or exceptions or deviations for bad behavior there could be, might be a way to kind of thread that needle.
Well, it's always, if I may, Angela, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. No, of course, everything is on the agenda. Everything could be discussed. But we heard the DG saying that one of her priorities, and also in discussions with ambassadors, was how can we assure that the least developed countries are also included in the global economy? And of course, you're absolutely right, Jake. There are lots of exceptions to MFN, and the EU has done a lot of free trade agreements lately. And of course, the MFN is sort of reserved for the partners there. But if we get away with the fundamental system, the losers would be the poorest countries, and that would undermine the idea of the WTO, as I see it.
If I can jump in on that, I mean,
yes, please.
So, I look at some tangential things that are going on, because MFN and the principle of non-discrimination won't just stay where that is. It will spread to other areas. So, for example, again, I'm in Brussels today. There's a lot of discussion about made in Europe. looking at the government procurement agreement and applying Made in Europe to parties that are a part of the government procurement agreement. I guess that goes to this kind of MFN with reciprocity that that we're talking about here. But indeed, I think that most in the business community have benefited from MFN, not just because of tariffs, but because it means that they have not been disadvantaged in other parts of the economy as well. And so I understand, I sometimes think MFN is kind of inelegantly named because it implies, I mean, it's about non-discrimination, but it actually implies something else. The real issue here is that we have industrial policy coming into play. We have overproduction, overcapacity at a scale that was never envisioned, and that is creating issues that just cannot be addressed politically at the moment in the WTO. There are mechanisms that could be addressed from a policy or other perspective, but politically it just can't be addressed. The predatory pricing that's going on in certain segments, such as critical minerals, can't be addressed in the WTO. And so what you're doing is, I think we're slowly hobbling the WTO and taking it back to either a previous form or even back before that. And I think that's going to be really what's on the table. And that's what ministers and the political consensus coming out of MC-14 is really going to be, is how big and ambitious will the WTO be moving forward? Or will we go back to a GATT world? Or will we go back to something even further because of the root cause of these problems, which are not necessarily what's being addressed in some of these proposals?
Anyone else like to comment? Okay. Great. Okay. Ambassador Tan, did you?
No,
Yes,
I
please.
just want to chip in and say here that, you know, taking off from what Penny and Cecilia have said, we really have to ask ourselves whether we are barking up the wrong tree. Can MFN or can addressing or reviewing MFN be the solution to some of the really macroeconomic challenges that we faced? I don't have an answer, but I think that's a question that we should seriously ponder.
Well, you're right that we don't have the answer on that, but I think we can be sure that it will be the subject of lots of discussion among the members, if not at MC-14, certainly in terms of the subsequent work. So thanks to everyone for your. Penny, did you have another word?
I just wanted to jump back in. I mean, one of the things that I think that we're also dancing around is a little bit around trust, and the fact that there is a lack of trust at the moment. When you set up a consensus-based organization with a single set of rules, and not everybody has complied with them over the last 25 years. What's happening is that the reliability, the predictability, the fairness, I think, just hasn't been there. And so we've seen that erosion in trust over the years. The question is, where do we go? And how do we take this forward? And again, I want to bring up the plurilaterals again, because I think the plurilaterals is something that we need to really be focused on as a possible outcome of MC-14. And I just want to put it out there again because of the issues around critical minerals. I know that the WTO Secretariat has been tracking all of the bilateral or sectoral critical minerals agreements that are out there. The US has proposed and has out for comment at the moment a plurilateral agreement on critical minerals where they do not mention the WTO. So really, I think if we are going to move away from, if we either, I think, need to decide that we're going to stay with a consensus-driven WTO, which has advantages, but also some significant disadvantages, or if we're going to move to this world where we acknowledge that there's maybe the trust is not there, and we're going to have to come up with new ways to ensure that the members' interest in the various really important issues that need to be discussed will have a forum where they can be addressed, even if it is not at a consensus level within the WTO.
Well, I think that's an important point, and I'd like to move the discussion now to plurilaterals, to probe some of the thoughts that you just raised. Plurilaterals, of course, coalitions of the willing, provide the opportunity for members within the WTO rulebook to negotiate agreements, but in order for them to be adopted into the multilateral rulebook, we need to have consensus among the members, even from members who are not party to this agreement and don't take on any of the obligations. It's an opportunity among members who participate to adopt more ambitious rules and standards to incubate these rules. And as Penny is saying, to new ways to discuss and find solutions among the membership. But the WTO struggles to get these agreements adopted into the multilateral rulebook because this concept of course, this governing principle of consensus. So how do we navigate this impasse that we're facing, for example, with the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement? One member that objected on ideological grounds has removed its objection, South Africa. And but still there is another member that opposes, saying that this is not an appropriate use of WTO resources. So Hung Sen, maybe I'll start with you there, since you've been so actively involved in plurilaterals. How do we address this problem that we're facing, the difficulty of putting plurilaterals into the rulebook when there is objection by just a few?
Well, that's $1 million question, Angela. And I think if we can find the answer to that question, it will put the WTO in a much better place. But let me just make three points. The first is really to underline that the practice of decision-making by consensus in the WTO is very much cherished and valued by all members. So the question before us is not whether we should or we want to change that practice, but really how do we make consensus decision-making more outcome-oriented? I think that is the key question that we have to ask ourselves. It's not whether we should have consensus decision-making, but rather how do we make consensus decision-making more outcome-oriented. That brings me to the second point. And here there are two ideas that Singapore has mooted and which we believe can help to contribute to a more outcome-oriented decision-making process. And the first idea is responsible consensus. What does it mean? As we know, the root of the problem is really not in the practice of consensus decision-making. Rather, it is the abuse of this practice by a small number of members that have paralyzed the WTO. So if the WTO wants to remain relevant, it must be able to operate more nimbly and constructively amidst all this diversity of views, which is why Singapore had advocated responsible consensus, and it essentially calls on members to 1, negotiate in good faith, 2, negotiate based on evidence, and 3, to seek win-win outcomes. And in a similar vein, China had also proposed the idea of Pareto consensus, which essentially calls on members to exercise restraint in blocking consensus where a decision enjoys a substantial majority of support and without making any members worse off. The other concept is flexible multilateralism. And I think it's really important that members embraced flexible multilateralism because it will allow those members, the coalition of the willing, as you have said, who are ready to advance on issues of shared interest, while, very importantly, keeping the doors open for others to join when they are ready. And this, as Ngozi had highlighted earlier, is embedded in the Marrakesh Agreement. In other words, plurilateral initiatives are very much in the DNA of the WTO. The third and last point is to think of creative and innovative ways to operationalize these two concepts. Co-sponsors of a plurilateral agreement should not be held hostage just because one or two members disagree and are able to block its incorporation. We must have the agency to find a way around such a situation. And here, I think we would have to be more action-oriented, adopt Nike's slogan of just do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just do it. So when you mention not to hold hostage the will of most members to move, let's say, on a particular plurilateral, how do you give them the agency to find the way around? I think maybe this gets back to Penny's point about building trust, where we have members who are so concerned that the move towards plurilateralism means that their priorities and what they believe to be mandates in the multilateral context just simply aren't going to be addressed, and that the resources will go elsewhere, and we'll end up with this conglomeration of more plurilateral types of arrangements. How do we address that point? Please.
That's a real concern, whether perceived or real, it is a concern. And the short answer to your question is really to provide greater opportunities for developing members with those concerns to level up and to be able to join these plurilateral initiatives. So that goes back to the issue of capacity building. And here, we have to acknowledge and recognize that the WTO is not a development agency. We don't have the capacity to do that. So we'll have to be creative and find ways and means to leverage on the strength of our partners, be they private sector, be they other international organizations like the World Bank, IMF, so that we could mobilize and harness resources from various sources in order to help developing members level up narrow the gap, and hopefully in the process, they will not have the feeling that they are being left behind. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you. And certainly technical assistance and capacity building is such an important focus of the WTO. And unfortunately, one of the first things to go when the budget is not adequate and members don't pay their dues. Cecilia, over to you.
I think this is a very important discussion, and it's not new. It's been going on for a very long time, of course, and we see it also in other organizations. In the European Union, we're also struggling with one country blocking a lot of decisions, whereas 26 wants to move on. And I think the concept of responsible consensus is very important. We also talk about sometimes about constructive abstention, so that you can abstain in a constructive way when you see that there's a very large majority wanted to move on. So being creative is the key here, trying to find a way to rebuild trust. Of course, technical assistance is important, as the ambassador said, and you also, Angela, finding a political way. What is it that can move forward? Of course, we know that some countries are blocking plurilaterals because they feel betrayed that the Doha round is not concluded. I mean, that is correct, but there is no way we can revive the Doha round as it used to be. But there might be elements there, so there needs to be much more political activities, and that must happen in the capitals. Political activities to find, is there something from the Doha agenda that we can bring on and put on the agenda? I know there's a lot of pressure on agriculture, for instance. Maybe that can be a way to put it. And then to make plurilaterals attractive enough for countries to want to join. That is, of course, also something that countries can say, okay, well, we will conclude this anyway, even if 5, 1 or 6 countries are not on board, and we will make sure that to show you that it is actually a very good thing to join. So a mixture of activism, creativity, and political engagement, because as much as they are super clever ambassadors in Geneva and they work hard, of course, they are dependent on a mandate from the capitals, and therefore you need to get ministers involved to try to break those political impasses.
I think that's a really important point about the political will, the political mandate needing to come from capitals, and the discussions also happening not just in Geneva, but among capitals, so in other contexts as well, and that can feed into the process. Anyone else want to chime in on this before we go to, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, well, let's go ahead to that to that question, and Hung Sen, this is a question I'd like you to take the lead on, if you would. The middle powers, that is a great term, I think, have been quite assertive of late, pushing the rest of the world to step up within the WTO and in other contexts as well. We've seen CBTPP expand. We've seen the launch of FTIP, and recent statements by the Singapore Prime Minister and by the Canadian Prime Minister that have questioned the stability of the traditional world order certainly have been noted and commented on quite heavily in trade circles and beyond. So what does this mean for the WTO? Do you see a role for this group of countries who have really relied on the WTO system and gotten great benefit from this system? Do you see these countries taking an even more active role, because they've traditionally been quite active, but do you see them as taking an even more active role, and what does this mean for the WTO? Ambassador.
Well, let me just start, first of all, Angela, by saying that you like the term middle power. I don't really like it, especially for a small member like Singapore, I think it's a bit presumptuous for us to think of Singapore as a middle power. I think a more appropriate characterization would be members who are friends of the system, who value the system, and who are committed to preserve and to strengthen the rules-based multilateral trading system. Why? Because as we have all observed, we are faced with a changed world. And for small and medium-sized countries, and I think for the vast majority of WTO members, the rules-based multilateral trading system is really existential. One of my former prime ministers was once asked, why does Singapore attach so much importance to the WTO? And his answer was very simple. Imagine ourselves in an arm wrestling match. A small country like Singapore, very trade dependent, trade is 3 times our GDP. In such an arm wrestling match, there is no question that the bigger guy would prevail. So the rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core is really important for us. My second point is that during these challenging times, there's even greater impetus for friends of the system to come together because we must demonstrate that we have agency. And it is in this context that you have seen the establishment of the FIT partnership, Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, comprising at the moment 16 members. And just yesterday, the FIT partnership issued a ministerial declaration reaffirming our commitment to strengthen the rules-based trading system. So this is a concrete example of friends of the system coming together to demonstrate, 1, that we have agency, 2, we are committed to strengthening the rules-based system, and 3, we can serve as catalyst or even sandboxed for new and innovative ideas. So these initiatives like FIT partnership and even the CPTPP EU collaboration, I think they should not be seen as attempts to replace or undermine the WTO. We should approach it as many helping hands to support the WTO system. And these friends of the system have been very active, pushing for reform, generating innovative ideas to strengthen the system. In other words, these initiatives should be seen as complementary pathways that will eventually reinforce the trading system. I will just end because there have been many references to WTO architecture. So let me use the analogy of a house. I think when the WTO was established in 1995, there were 76 members who were largely like-minded, and globalization, or some people call it hyper-globalization, was driving the global economy and world trade. Comparative advantage, cooperation, and the rule of law underpin that order. And these factors shaped the architecture of the house, that is WTO. which was designed to accommodate 76 members who were committed to observe the same rules. 31 years on, the world has changed, and the WTO membership has grown to 166. And more importantly, it has become more diverse. As a result, the dynamics have changed, expectations have changed, but the original design of the house has not changed. The new occupants also want to rearrange the furniture and even change the layout of the house. So what can we do? I think one way would be to enlarge the house, but without altering the superstructure. Because as Ngozi has pointed out, and many of us have also observed, the superstructure has served members well and continue to be useful. So one possibility would be to add a second story to the house, but not in a hierarchical way. The second story is intended to provide more space so that all the occupants can move around without bumping into each other, and everyone can pursue their interests while cooperating and coexisting with each other. Most importantly, there is an elevator or a lift to connect the two stories of the house so that occupants can move freely up and down. In short, it will be a two-story house that is inclusive, that is built on the foundation of the original house, but upgraded to reflect the new realities. So that's a rather long answer to your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I love your analogy. And I certainly think it comes down to, like you said, the friends of the system, we need more friends. The WTO needs more friends. And I like your point about many helping hands, complementary pathways, because after all, it takes a village, and many hands make light work, to take these metaphors to an extreme. So we are out of time, unfortunately, but thanks very much to all of you for such a terrific discussion. We really covered the waterfront and your perspectives on issues ranging from reform, the future of the WTO, to AI, digital trade, to how to rebuild trust and empower all the membership, I think are incredibly important for our audience. Thanks to the questions, thanks to the audience for their questions. I tried to weave them in here and there where I could. And I think with that, I turn it over to you, Ken. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Cecilia, Jake, Penny, Hung Seng. Truly appreciate your making the time to join us today. This series and this panel highlighted both the opportunities and the challenges facing the WTO, and the opportunity to be able to move the organization forward into the future and to address the challenges that we all face. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this series, Angela. And thanks as well to Director General Okonjo Iweala and the Secretariat, to the 10 ambassadors who joined us in this series, all our guests who spoke, all of you who are in attendance in the audience. Thank you for joining us today. For any of the events in our series, I just dropped the link back in to all the YouTube videos to catch up with all that was talked about in the other sessions, including on reform, which I know we touched on quite a bit today. Thank you, Angela, again. Thank you, Cecilia, Jake, Penny, and Hung Seng. Appreciate you very much. Thank you all.